Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Keat TV in Northern California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Folks following the kinds of topics we cover on the show often demand these subjects be taken more seriously by academics and the intellectual elite. It's not hard to see why. So many of our smartest people remain happily convinced that we're closing in on the last details of what will soon be a complete and unified knowledge of things. This confidence arises despite mounting evidence to the contrary, including the testimony and experience of thousands and a few pesky anomalies that won't comfortably resolve into whatever theories and equations we've prepared for them. Humanity has been here before repeatedly and has always been disabused of its arrogance. Last time, quantum theory was dropped like a squalling infant into our laps just as the self-congratulatory cocktail party was getting started. There is even a name for it, presentism. This time, for sure, we've really figured things out. So much of what we heard from our many guests and listeners on this show strains the conditioned intellect. If taken seriously, such testimony could well represent a death blow to physicalist materialism, and at the very least, it demands a more modest assessment of our grasp on how the universe works. Life on other planets, life in forms we don't understand, interstellar and perhaps faster than light travel, psionic abilities, mind as the fundament of this universe, the presence here and now on Earth of non-human intelligence, the efficacy and truth perhaps of ancient mystical traditions. These are the deep issues we consider, and we want science and academia to take them seriously. So when they do, let's not demand agreeable outcomes. Our guest today, philosophy professor Stephen Brown from Ohio State University, has engaged with these anomalous topics and learned some things through science. Taking a risk to his reputation, he engaged with the Nazca mummies and entertained the possibility that they were legitimate skeletons. Then, because of his team's research, he later began to doubt their authenticity as aliens and publicly said so. Such is how scholarship works. Yet hardcore believers attacked him, called him a puppet of the deep state, and posted memes to that effect. How can we expect academics and scientists to engage with such a subject when their only reward will likely be ridicule from the establishment and ire from passionate believers? Welcome to the show, Stephen.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I found out about you after watching one of your electrifying videos. You're a fantastic lecturer, and
Thank you.
you were talking about at the time the possibility that these Nazca mummies may represent something anomalous and something interesting that we need to take a closer look at. I find that your current position, if I'm not mistaken, is that they still need to be looked at, but that more as archaeological kind of recreations or something to that effect rather than as alien specimens. But can you talk a little bit about how you were drawn into this particular topic in the beginning and your journey to build a team and then actually do research that will help determine one way or the other whether they were actually anomalous?
Yeah, sure. It's been a rapid fire journey for me. I my background is as a religious person. I grew up in Christianity and took that very, very seriously. Still take it very seriously, although I have significantly different views at this point than I did in my kind of home of origin. But as I kind of grew into a more intellectually curious person, well, let me go a little step back. So in particular, the kind of Christianity that I grew up in was a kind of anti-science, anti-rationality kind of Christianity. So people talked about even going to seminary as potentially dangerous to your faith. They would jokingly call it cemetery. But certainly engaging with science was a kind of dangerous thing to do. I was raised among young Earth creationists, so people who believe that the Earth was made about 6 to 10,000 years ago, and that evolution is a lie, and all of that kind of stuff. That was the world that I grew up in. And as I kind of moved into high school and later college, I took a lot of interest in science, and so I started. Um, Questioning a lot of that. And what ended up happening for me is there was kind of what happens to a lot of people in the religious space who can kind of continue to take their faith seriously, but also try to take science and things seriously is they kind of move to brush aside the kind of oddities of religion and kind of focus on some of the core um, philosophical, moral, ethical kinds of things. So I think like most people who get advanced degrees in philosophy, for instance, who kind of engage the religious space seriously on a personal level, I had a kind of philosopher's god, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and such. The kind of first cause idea, the thing that explains the existence of everything, cosmological arguments in particular, I found compelling, still find compelling. And as a Christian, I took seriously the work of people like Richard Swinburne and others who kind of work on specifically miracles and the idea of the resurrection. Of course, the idea of the resurrection is extremely important in Christianity. But other than that, I would basically just not engage these kind of unusual things on the sidelines, which are all over the Christian scriptures and actually all over, every other major body of religious texts and traditions and stories. I would just ignore them. And then what happened to me was, well, a couple things happened to me. As I continued on here at Ohio State, I was originally a graduate student and then a lecturer, and now I'm what's called a teaching professor. Um, I began teaching the Asian philosophies class every semester, and I really started falling in love with Buddhism in particular, but picking up interesting elements from other traditions like Hinduism and Jainism and Taoism and Shinto, and just kind of falling into this space where I didn't quite know how to reconcile all of these things, but I felt like they were all important um uh and trying to do that in a way that wasn't just saying like, oh, they're all saying the same thing, because they're actually not really saying all the same thing,
Yeah.
even though there are important themes between them. Okay, anyway, so that was kind of me before David Grush. And
Yeah.
then David Grush hits in the summer of 23. And I read the article that was published in the Debrief the day that it came out. And of course, he makes these very spectacular claims that the US has had these UFOs and alien bodies or biological specimens of some kind that are not human, and that they've been doing this for since like the 30s or 40s. Um, and I followed up on the fact checks that the debrief did over the next couple of days and became convinced that he was who he said he was, and that he would therefore have access to information. If these things were true, he would be able to tell that, and he was acting like someone telling the truth and putting himself at personal risk for reasons which didn't make a lot of sense to me. Being taken very seriously by people in the intelligence community, the Inspector General of the intelligence community, people in the intelligence committees in Congress, and just everywhere I looked from then on, it just began to make more and more sense to believe him.
Hmm.
And that has led me to what's now been about a year and a half's worth of trying to engage. Like I really appreciated your introduction. There's a whole range of phenomena that people are experiencing that are outside the kind of canonical orthodoxy of the day.
Hmm.
And the standard wisdom is that all of these are either hoaxes or delusions, or somehow to be safely dismissed and ignored. And for me, the UFO case was the one that kind of pushed me past that. But at this point, having been doing this for a while, I am now among those who believe that we are on the verge of a very substantial paradigm shift, which will require that we call a lot of things about these kind of they're not really scientific assumptions. They're actually philosophical assumptions that we
Hmm.
glue onto our science, right? Like
Yeah.
science is essentially just the practice of making observations and coming up with hypotheses and testing them with more observations and trying to correct based on data, right? That's what science is. But there's become this kind of popular assumption that in addition to that, we should believe in something like materialism, and something like at least a light determinism, even though we know that determinism is technically false because of quantum mechanics. We can still act like determinism is true for the most part. Yeah, so I suspect that that view is just wrong. And that one of the reasons why we're missing on on all of these various strange phenomena, why we can't account for them, is not because they're not real. It's because they don't fit into the kind of presumptive worldview that we have.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this is where I think we are.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that's exactly the journey that I've taken. I started a little bit before Grush. It was Lou Elizondo who got
Yeah,
me, and I read Leslie Kean's book, UFOs and Generals, or something like that, and that opened my mind a lot. And then Lou came out, and it was like, holy mackerel, this guy knows what he's talking about. He,
yeah,
like Grush, he would be in a position to know, and he's saying these things. And it led me down a rabbit hole where basically I think, have come to the conclusion, like you, that the materialist paradigm is not inaccurate. It's just insufficient. It covers
yeah,
what it covers, and it works great for the building of toys and televisions and cell phones and all those sorts of things. But there's something else going on that we don't capture with what we're studying a lot of the time in science. And so that has led me down, and you were mentioning earlier, which sort of interested me as well, your experience with, sort of Eastern philosophical traditions. I wonder, is there a way that one informed the other? I mean, you mentioned that that was sort of a preamble into the Grush thing. Can you describe how the two relate for you? Because they very much relate for me in my own search.
yeah. Great question. So it was basically for me, the kind of paradigm, we don't really have a homogenous paradigm, right? Like, and obviously, I've spent almost all of my life here in the United States. I've had the great privilege to be able to travel around the world a decent amount. But I'm very much an American. So there's not a homogenous paradigm in the United States. There's a kind of bifurcated paradigm, right? There's the materialist, scientific, pseudo-determinist kind of worldview. And then there's basically Christianity in its various forms and things that are similar enough to Christianity from a Christian's perspective, right? Like Judaism or Islam.
Yeah.
And so those are kind of the intellectually respectable views that get airtime. Yeah, so what happened to me was as I started teaching this class over and over and over again, I've taught it every semester for about 10 years now, a little more than 10 years. Um, I just realized that I had all of these assumptions about how the world works. And in particular, assumptions about what the self is and how the self relates to the rest of reality. So, for instance, in Hinduism, there's a number of different schools of Hinduism. Hinduism is a tremendously diverse set of traditions, so one has to be very careful when speaking of Hinduism not to oversimplify too much.
Mhm.
But there's a general theme in Hinduism that everything is interconnected somehow, and that the mental is primary, that consciousness itself is the core of reality, and that this world of plurality and change that we live in some schools is just an illusion to be transcended. Like actually everything is just one consciousness itself and everything else is illusion. That's the Advaita Vedanta tradition. And other traditions, allow that this world of plurality and change is real, but it connects into this kind of fundamental unified consciousness. Um, and they basically all agree that we can have these experiences of transcendence and oneness and unity in deep meditative states, right? And so that got me pondering. And of course, they believe in a cycle of death and rebirth. So believing that that one lifetime is not the whole of the story for whatever the individual is. Um, and so that got me thinking about some stuff, and then I turned or learned more about Buddhism, and Buddhism is just challenging the idea of a unified self entirely, right? So
Yeah.
like the self in Hinduism is the Sanskrit term is Atman, and in so there's kind of one Atman, the self, the big self, is Brahman, which is essentially like something like the concept of God, like the foundational ultimate reality. Atman is Brahman. Whereas in Buddhism, the claim is Anatman, there is no self. So that got me really puzzling about what I am, and even kind of doing the standard thought experiments that Buddhists go through, like imagine to myself, what am I? Well, I am a body, and my body is not one thing. My body is many things, right? I have fingers and toes and organs, and I also have perceptions of the world, but my perceptions aren't unified. I see things, I hear things, I smell things, but all of those are varied and constantly changing, right? Like I have internal feelings, emotions, those are constantly fluctuating and changing. I have ideas, and that's constantly fluctuating and changing. I have some experience of consciousness, but it's not unified either. We all know what it's like to like decide to go to the grocery store to buy something and then get there and be like, I can't remember what it was, and then try really hard to remember what it is in your conscious space, and
Hmm.
then be like, I don't know, I guess I'll just go get something else. And then it comes right into your mind, and it's like, okay, so like we all know that we are composite objects that are made up of all kinds of parts that are constantly fluctuating, and these images that Buddhism uses about like rivers and like the burning of flames, and like there's not a thing there. There's this constant flowing and changing and shifting of things. And okay, so all of this is just like calling kind of philosophically, religiously into question these assumptions that I have that I am like a thing, either in the kind of a Christian space, like I am a singular soul that passes through one life and then goes to an afterlife, or the kind of materialist idea, I am a body, like a physical object, and that when I die, my body end or my existence comes to an end, and just realizing, well, there's just a lot of other options that have been very well thought out and
Yeah.
articulated and incorporated into ethics and society and spiritual practices. And so all of that, I think, kind of set me up for when I kind of realized that there was this big gap in my understanding of the world. And for me, it was the UFOs, right? Like I had just assumed that uh, everything, I assumed that the orthodoxy, that everything about UFOs is nonsense, not even worth wasting your time looking at, right?
Yeah.
And then when I went to look at it, I just realized, oh no, there's just a huge amount of data here, just thousands and thousands of people's experiences, and there's just this image of like UFO experiences, like dumb people who are uneducated and just jumping to and like no, like among the most brilliant people you can imagine
Exactly. Yes.
are the people who are having these experiences and seeing these things. And yeah, so I don't know how much of an answer that is about how it kind of relates to me. I guess I
Perfect.
just got used to the fact in doing this kind of cross-cultural philosophy in the religious space, I got used to the fact that there are many ways of thinking about the world that we generally don't think of, especially in America. And that therefore it seemed quite plausible to me that we might be making a really substantial mistake, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, even if you imagine the like the just the kind of ordinary bifurcated worldview of the United States, like take some very serious Christians and compare them to some very serious materialist atheists. Like they still think that other party, even if you only think there's two options, you think the other option is wrong, and that they're making like fundamental mistakes about the nature of reality.
Mhm.
Well, then you should at least consider the possibility that you might be the one making the fundamental mistakes
Yeah.
about reality, right?
Exactly.
And so like intellectual humility and honesty just sort of requires that we say, well, we should at least consider the possibility that whatever I feel comfortable with is wrong. Because I believe, in as much as I believe anything, I believe that everybody who disagrees with me is wrong.
Hmm.
So I should at least entertain the possibility that maybe I'm the one that's wrong or among the
Yeah.
ones that are wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a big leap for people these days.
It is.
I don't know if it's social media or what, but that whole idea of maybe I'm wrong seems to have left the behavioral vocabulary of most folks,
It's interesting
unfortunately.
that yeah, social media is making it worse. I
Yeah.
agree. But yeah, I agree. There's a friend of mine, Anil, who I actually got to know because of the Nazca mummies, because I changed my mind.
Hmm.
And he came to me and he was like, Steve, I just love what you did. And I think we as a society should celebrate when we discover that we're wrong, right?
Exactly right.
Like we have this feeling of shame when it happens, and that motivates us to kind of double down and stick inside of our errors, right? Whereas what we should be doing when we discover that we've made an error is rejoice. Oh, good. I can cast aside some error that I had. I've picked up some interesting new insight. I'm getting closer I'm
Yeah.
making progress, right? Like that's what
Yeah.
it is to discover that you're wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested. So you mean you had this epiphany where you realized that there may be more going on to things than you had previously understood, and then you decided to put your own reputation on the line a little bit with it. I mean, with these lectures that were highly popular online, and that led you into even further research. What was the triggering moment for that transition? Why did you feel like you wanted to actually, get your hands dirty rather than just sort of observe it from afar?
I'm not a very good observe it from afar person. In general, I mean, so I appreciate your kind words about my teaching. My teaching matters a lot to me. One of the reasons why I am a good teacher is because I only teach the things I love, and
Hmm.
I only teach the things that I believe truly matter.
Yeah.
And so the kind of emotional and personal distance between me and my subject matter is very, very small, right? Like I'm perfectly willing and in fact eager to teach things that I believe might be wrong.
Hmm.
But that's not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to get people to agree with me, but like I only teach things that I believe are important, right?
Yeah.
And so when this stuff hit me, like it immediately was just obvious. Oh my God, if David Grush is telling the truth, then even if he is wrong about 98% of the details, right? If there is anything to this story, then this changes everything. And
Exactly.
and I really truly mean that. Like
Hmm.
it changes the way that we think about politics and economics and religion and psychology and the nature of well-being and the nature of ethics. And oh my God, it changes absolutely everything. And so I went through this experience that people call ontological shock, which is um, ontology is the nature of being, and so you kind of realize that your understanding of the nature of the world is wildly wrong. And what happens when that happens is you just start to oscillate. So like, okay, here's normal, and David Grush hits and I'm like, okay, well I guess I can't be normal anymore, but I can try to stay kind of close to normal, right? But if what David Grush is saying is true, then I guess Roswell probably happened. And if Roswell probably happened, then I guess these abductions have probably happened. And then I guess probably the crop circles are real and probably the cattle mutilations are real. And I guess that means that there's a pretty serious government cover up. And then you just find yourself all the way down this like like you said, the rabbit holes. Like there's just like a whole warren of them. And so what happens is kind of you kind of start out as normal and then you kind of accept this or you discover and end up swallowing this like anomalous piece of data that doesn't fit, right? Like the
Hmm.
David Grush is telling the truth about UFO recovery programs, right? And then it's like, well, gosh, if that's true, then I guess Roswell probably happened because that's, there's a good amount of evidence. People have been talking about this for a while. And if that happened, then what else has happened and what other conspiracies are true and how many other paranormal things turn out to be real, right? And then you just find yourself way further than you feel comfortable being, right?
Yeah.
Do I have to believe in Bigfoot now? Do I have to believe in ghosts? Do I have to believe in like secret Nazi bases under Antarctica? What? How wrong am I? Right?
Yeah.
And so there's just this like very difficult experience of like it reevaluating and reevaluating and reevaluating and kind of trying to find some new normal where you're like, okay, I can just believe in objects in the sky, like what President Barack Obama said on the James Corden show,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um, or I can say, I can just believe that there are, flying saucers and maybe they're from China or something. But I don't have to believe in aliens, or I can believe in aliens, but I don't have to believe in angels, or I can believe in angels, but I don't have to believe in telepathic children. But what happens is the further you go, the more it just seems like, oh man, like is most of this actually happening? Because for me at this point, I was able to give a talk at Yale. It was just at the Yale UFO Society. It was a wonderful experience. But when I say that, I don't want people to think like Yale University invited us to come and give a talk, right? It was more of a guerrilla effort than that, right? But it was a wonderful experience, and I got to meet this philosopher named Michael Glosson, who's now a very good friend of mine. Um, and he in particular was saying that there's this danger that we have right now as the United States in particular begins to take the UFO UAP phenomenon seriously. Um, that we will just be like, oh, it's basically spaceships, because spaceships we understand, and that's all that's going on, and I'm not going to believe anything else that's weird, right? And he just put pressure on that, like once you accept one of these anomalous things, like you really do need to start considering a bunch of the other ones because they're all kind of similarly situated. Where, I mean, so I don't want to say that everything anomalous is similarly situated, but it turns out that there are a lot of things
Mhm.
that we see kind of across time, across cultural contexts, with people of high degrees of intelligence and education, taking them seriously, trying to do science, trying to like create controlled environments and test hypotheses and getting bizarre results that don't fit the paradigm, right?
Yeah.
And that is happening across a whole range of disciplines. And then for me, all of this gets back to this question you asked me a moment ago. I kind of go back and I say, is there a worldview that can accommodate this kind of stuff? And like just in the background, it's like, yeah, most of the Asian traditions are very comfortable with all of this.
Yeah.
And basically, all of the indigenous traditions are very comfortable with all of
Yeah.
this. You're actually only surprised, Steve. My wife likes to tell me you're only having such a hard time because you thought you understood everything, and
Yeah.
and you thought you were right, and you thought you were right. She doesn't say this, but I don't. This is kind of a. We basically thought we were right because we thought the Europeans figured out the world, and then they
Yeah.
suppressed all the dumb ideas, and they were correct in doing that. Like at the end of the day, it really is as stupid as colonialism.
Yeah. No, I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that it's fascinating to me, like going back and one of the things that I've been doing over the past 2.5 years or so is going back and reviewing all these traditions that have pieces or a better grasp potentially on what we could be living within. And I mean, you're right. The Eastern traditions and the Aboriginal, systems, shamanic traditions. There's also like the perennial philosophy that was sort of like the mystery schools or whatever of ancient Greece and Egypt that had this notion, and they kind of kept it, on the esoteric side, I think, where they were
Hmm.
revealing it to people who they believed had reached a certain point of spiritual maturation or whatever. Um, but it's been something that's been with us for a long time, and that is another confirming point for me. It's like when
Yeah.
I was wrestling with all this, I'm like, this is not something that our generation has just stumbled upon. This has been going on forever, and we're one of the few exceptional, civilizations that has pushed it away, and we're just kind of realizing that maybe that was an error. And
Yeah.
um, and the other thing about that I've kind of you were talking about all the different facets of paranormal phenomenon that kind of um, have to be true or may be true because of what we've come to find out about UFOs and stuff. It seems like a lot of them are sort of the meeting of realms in a way. Like
Yeah.
there seems to be this idea or this the presence of some sort of transcendent element to reality, and where the two um, worlds sort of collide is where these phenomenologies arise. So like near-death experiences are one that I feel like I have to take seriously now. Telepathy or psi ability is something I feel like I need to take seriously now. All of those sort of represent, I think, the coming together of these two, whether it's dimensions, if that's a word we can use. I mean, I think that that's an abuse of the scientific notion of a dimension, but it seems to be the best word that applies. And so then it's like, well, how do you ground yourself, like for me, in a practice that helps me try and, cultivate my own
Mm.
personal awareness of that transcendent place? That's sort of where I've settled out, like trying to build, I guess, my own philosophical underpinnings to kind of pursue it. And then having these conversations, which is my passion, is finding intelligent people like yourself who've made the same journey or further ahead than I am, and just kind of grokking, these same issues and trying to game out where we end up as a society as a result, And I think that that's the scary but exciting question.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I love how you brought it back to the kind of personal, practical side of things because at this point I attract and create weird people, right?
Of course, yes.
Because I'm taking things seriously and I'm talking about them boldly, and and I'm not backing down, right? And so because of that, I'm shoving people into ontological shock, or I'm meeting people. People are kind of rushing to me in ontological shock, trying to like you've at least been doing this for a little bit longer than me.
Yeah,
How are you doing this? And one of the things I give them, just as a piece of advice, is you need to let go of the idea that you are going to understand what's going on.
yeah.
Like like the list of things that you just said. I'm with you, right? Like ESP and after life after death, past life memories. Um, for me, I'm way further down the rabbit hole than that, right? Like we could go crazy. Like I bet Bigfoot is a thing. I
Oh,
bet
sure.
that
Yeah. I mean, there's very
yeah.
little I totally reject now, I mean,
Yeah,
whether or
so
not,
me too, right?
yeah.
Like okay, so we could build out a list here and it would be pretty long, and then all of those are heresies, right? And
Hmm.
and so like if I literally just walk down the hall and knock on somebody else's door and say, I believe one of these things should be taken seriously, they will, and not this is not hypothetical. They do look at me like I'm crazy, right?
Yeah.
And that has actual social costs, right? Like people
Sure. Yeah.
stop talking to you because they don't know how to handle the fact that you're taking this seriously, right?
Yeah.
There was actually a lecture given in our department by a guest lecturer from another department, but talking about the epistemology of kind of fringe beliefs and how it's perfectly rational to completely ignore them and not even engage the possibility that you might be wrong, right? This is actually a lecture that was given here, not by one of our faculty, but I just raised my hand in this talk, and I was like, I mean, but like somebody at some point has to ask, right? Because we've been wrong about a lot of things, as you indicated at the
Yeah.
beginning, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if some of us don't at least sometimes ask questions like these, then we will persist in error forever, right? And I'm going to get back to the personal side in just a second, but while we're
Yeah.
right
No, I love
here,
it. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that the best way to think about this is as a healthy epistemic community, which is a little bit like a healthy biological ecosystem. It should have diversity in it. Like we actually do need and should celebrate and embrace the people who are kind of foot draggers, right? Who are like the hyper skeptics, right?
Yeah.
They're kind of like white blood cells. They're kind of like an immune system, right? Like trying to kill off fringe views. It's good that we have people like that.
Yeah.
It's also good to have people like me, who are more willing to go out on a limb, right? And like try on some stuff. And it's actually not possible to be an optimally rational singular human being, right? It's important that we have an epistemic ecosystem of kind of more inclined to believe, more inclined to disbelieve, and then we should be talking and listening, and like out of that emerges a healthy pursuit of the truth, right?
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I just wanted to say that because I think it's interesting. So I'm just saying to people like, okay, so once you swallow even one of these things, you're going to realize that there are a bunch of them, and then you're going to go into this shock experience where you don't have your bearings anymore,
Yeah.
and like get used to that. You're not going to figure this out. Like if any of these things are true, then several of them are probably true, which means that core elements of the way you've been trained to think about the world are completely wrong. So you're just not going to get from there to understanding how things work. Like it's going to take generations,
Generations.
maybe
Yes.
hundreds or thousands of generations to unpack all of this. And even then, we're probably going to be wrong, right? Because like we're wrong. We're
Because
very
we're
limited.
Yeah, and we have a perspective in a universe that's perhaps infinite or infinite. How are we ever going to really have a grasp on anything? I mean, it's all sort of semantic games we play with ourselves to find
Yes.
ways to be, to build an existence that's comfortable, but it's never actually, I think, the truth of things, but
Yeah. So back to the practical question that you brought up, which I was so happy that you did, that like, so then how do you live your life? Right?
yeah,
Like what do you do when your worldview is in shambles? Um, okay, so what you do is you start asking yourself, if I'm wrong about everything, what do I still care about?
yeah,
Right? And like it's really ultimately an ethics value, spirituality kind of a question, right? And for me, as someone who has a background in Christianity, I have those roots, right? And I go to like the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm like, I have no idea who Jesus was. I really don't. I'm more
hmm
puzzled than ever about who he was. But man, that sermon's awesome. Right?
yeah, yeah,
About like taking care of the poor and the powerless and being humble and kind and forgiving and like preferring, yeah, like okay, I don't know what else is true, but I want to be on that guy's team, right? Like
yeah,
I want to live like that. And I have similar relationships to Buddhism, right? Like the Sermon on the Four Noble Truths in particular, right? There's this kind of suffering that we have when we have these craving attachments, and we have to learn to let go of them and still be able to enjoy things when we have them. And like, okay, that's just true. Like, regardless
yeah,
of whatever else is true, that's just true. And I mean, I'm gonna love my wife, and I'm gonna love my kids, and I'm gonna teach my students, and I'm gonna like go for a walk, and I'm gonna breathe, and I'm gonna eat food, and I'm gonna drink tea. And it's like, okay, at the end of the day, like 99.9% of what I know I want to do with my life stays the same,
exactly
you
right.
know?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, maybe not that high. I spend at least a dozen hours a week on thinking about these things now. But you hear what I'm saying, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Your life as a whole pretty much won't change that much. I mean, you'll wake up in the
yeah,
morning, you'll have to pay your bills if that's what's needed to be done, or wash your car, or any of the things that you have to do are going to remain there for you to do. And so the structure, the shell outline of your life is pretty much going to remain the same. And there's
yeah,
comfort in that, even though, I mean, so many of us want to resist that, you know, um, the workaday world or whatever. There's comfort if you are going through this kind of ontological shock. I think that provides you with continuity and a way to like keep your wits about you.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there is this kind of amplified pressure, which we should be feeling anyways, to kind of lean into the spirituality space. Like I actually really have come to like vague terms like spirituality,
Hmm.
because it doesn't really have much meaning, but it kind of points in a certain direction, right?
Yeah.
But like whatever you're doing to kind of shut off the busyness of the world and create spaces where you seek out the good, the true, and the beautiful, and like, try to sit and breathe and go for a walk and stare into the sky and contemplate reality and reach out to the divine. And like, I don't know what any of those words really mean. No one really ever has understood what those words really mean.
Yeah.
Um, but there's something important about those. And I do feel, for me personally, an amplification in that space. Like, oh, the world is so strange right now. What do I want to do? I mean, I do have to pay my bills, and like, so I get that done. But also, I kind of want to ask these big questions about why we're so content with a world that's so distracting and so annoying and so frustrating. And like,
Toxic.
what can I do in my life to make some space for these things that are more beautiful and interesting and perplexing, mysterious?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think fellowship for me has been a part of that, having these
Mhm.
conversations, trying to help other people explore the same subjects. And then I have these groups of people that I've met and I have weekly conversations with them where we sort of rap about these sorts of things. And that's proven very therapeutic. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because we're all going through the same ontological shakedown. And two of them are science professors in Canada. And so they're kind of like trying to wrestle with how do they handle this in their profession and how do
Yeah.
they approach their subject matter in regards to that, and then what do they tell their students about their own feelings about some of the subject matter, which in classes this is verboten, this is the thing that is always true, and then to is it wrong to plant doubts if you're having those doubts yourself? I mean, that's just
Yeah.
interesting questions people are having.
Well, it is an
um
interesting question, and I guess I never particularly answered your question about how I got talking about the Nazca mummies at OSU, and,
yeah.
and it was really for these kinds of reasons that I mean, at that point, the first House oversight hearing with Grush and Graves and Fravor had
Hmm.
already happened, and I felt, for me, that was a real turning point in feeling emboldened, right?
Hmm.
Like, it is now obviously a subject of legitimate political or of legitimate academic inquiry to ask, what if, just what
Yeah.
if that were true, right? Because, and especially now that we've had another House Oversight Committee and we've had a Senate committee hearing, and that Senate hearing was disappointing for a lot of UFO heads, but
Hmm.
actually quite remarkable, all things considered, right? Because it was
Yeah.
the first time that the official group that's allowed to say things for real with the proper authority, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, it's the first time they said, here's what some of the unresolved cases look like. And
Yeah.
then he gave two of the craziest cases you could imagine. I mean,
Yeah.
not really. We know how crazy things get, right? But like a
Truly
car-sized black,
anomalous.
yeah,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
clearly anomalous, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's not a drone. And that's not a weather balloon. That's not a, I mean, that's the whole point of the actually anomalous cases. And so that Senate hearing was wonderful in being able to say, okay, look, the people who are looking, they do have anomalous cases, well testified to, well documented, probably with photographs, probably with video, definitely with radar data. Like, they have
Yeah.
serious anomalous cases that they're not telling us about. Anyways, so that kind of kind of first congressional hearing emboldened me to be able to say, all right, these are worth talking about. I'm allowed to talk about these. And I'm a philosopher, right? So we entertain all kinds of wild possibilities anyways.
Yeah.
And then the Nazca mummies hit, and like, they hit me like a train. Like what are these things?
Yeah.
And for me, it does get back to these kinds of kind of colonial mindsets, right? Like, there are very serious people scientists, scholars, medical professionals in Peru, in Mexico, looking at these things and saying, there's something here, there's something here, and everyone's just laughing at them.
Yeah.
And so I got mad, right? Like
Yeah.
why is no one taking these people seriously? And so I tried to take them seriously by giving that presentation, and then that presentation opened a whole lot of doors for me because people felt taken seriously. So they came to me,
Yeah.
scientists, journalists, they gave me all the information, right? I have all the CT scan information that was available when I was, mostly engaged in this several months ago. I have X-rays, I have the DNA data, and they were begging for people to listen to them, right?
Yeah.
Please take this and give it to anybody who will listen and figure out what's going on. And so I did, right? I went and I talked to people. I grabbed colleagues in the neighborhood around me, people online, and we looked at the information. And we came to this uncomfortable moment where we realized that, again, there's a false dichotomy going on, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
everyone assumes either it's a modern hoax built to make money so it looks like ET, or it's a dried up alien body. And
Hmm.
and what became the consensus of our team is that neither of those are true about certainly the littler ones, the what I call the J types, the ones like Josephina.
Hmm.
Um, and that they are neither coherent dried out bodies nor modern hoaxes. They seem to be something more complicated than that. The big ones, the M types like Maria, they remain complicated. I still think personally, and the kind of opinion of my group is that they are probably mutilated humans, but they were probably mutilated 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. And I suspect, personally, I'm not speaking for the team here, but I suspect that they were mutilated when they were alive. And so that there were people who spent, they were probably mutilated. I shouldn't say mutilated. They were altered because it was done on purpose for reasons unknown. Um, we actually have a specimen called Wawita, who is a young child, and her thumb and pinky were cut off, and her big toe and pinky toe were cut off on all of her hands and feet. Um, and I don't believe her hands have been slit or anything like that yet. But imagine that this is a process that takes place over a significant amount of years, like the skull binding, right? So they
Hmm.
bind the skulls of infants when the soft spot has not fused, and that changes the shape of the skull. And we know this happens all over the world. Like that definitely happened, and that definitely happened with these large mummies, right? Because they
Yeah.
have elongated skulls. So, well, okay. Under the assumption that we're not dealing with an alien or genetic alteration, which just run with me on that for a minute.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then like, okay, so we take a baby and we squeeze its skull, and at some point we cut off their fingers and toes, and at some point we slit their hands and feet, and then they heal, and then they grow, and then they use them, and then they would look like coherent tridactyl bodies because they are coherent tridactyl bodies.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you could do with a hand like that. You could probably do less than we can do with our. I mean, we could certainly do less because they don't have thumbs, right? But you may or may not be able to learn how to use a hand like that. They
Yeah.
might be essentially not useful at all. But that would be okay if this was only among like the royalty or the kind of priestly group,
Yeah. Clergy
right?
kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, they could be specialized members of the society who were treated with high reverence and then fed every day, which is basically what happens with monks anyways, right? Like monks who take vows of poverty. Like there's a couple of wonderful communities of Theravadan Buddhist monks that I'm close with here in Columbus, Ohio, and like they don't own anything and they don't cook anything and they don't buy anything. They just people bring them food every day and then they eat it, right? That's part of what the community does. So no, actually, that might just be what these are, right? The big ones, the M types, might just be modified humans, physically modified humans that grew into adulthood and then passed, and then were dried out and mummified, like other bodies were normally mummified in Peru, ancient Peru. And the little ones seem to be human infants, the J types, the ones like Josefina, that have been heavily modified post-mortem. Um, and the heads have been replaced
which is where the
sections of a llama skull. Yeah.
yeah. Which
But
okay,
I
so
do go ahead.
well, I have a follow-up question. It's interesting to me that these constructions are made or these alterations are made, and they push it toward a conception of an alien that we ourselves have that's not generated by these alterations. Like
Yeah.
somehow there seems to be something floating in human awareness about this particular kind of shape, the gray. I mean, just to put it, point blank, and
Yeah.
they were creating this artificially, if that's what was going on. But where does that information coming from? I mean, what are they
I agree.
emulating,
But it's so funny, right? Like the people who jump to the hoax conclusion, right? Like it couldn't be ancient because they look too much like ET. Like I've had somebody specifically yell that at me, right? Like they can't be real because they look like ET, right? And it's like, okay, just take ET off the table
Yeah,
because there are petroglyphs that look like this uh, all over the world, right?
yeah,
Like there are, I mean, the Nazca lines themselves. There are some of the Nazca lines that look kind of like this. So like I don't care what you think they are. There is art that looks like this in that part of the world at this point in time already.
yeah,
So like I don't know why ET looks like that. Maybe the causal explanation runs the other way, right? Like maybe somebody on Steven Spielberg's art direction crew was skimming through indigenous photographs of art in Peru and then decided to riff on that in science fiction. Maybe that's a possible explanation, right? But
yeah,
like the idea that they look like our modern concept of an alien, therefore it's a hoax, just ignores all of these other things in the ancient world that look like our modern concept of an alien, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
and okay, so let's just stop with the paradigm for a minute and say,
yeah,
what if all over the world people are encountering, they are having experiences of things that look like this?
yeah,
Now you can still do that as a materialist because
yeah,
you can still just be like, I don't know, there's some weird glitch in like the low level part of our brain that we inherited from the primates before we spread out all over the planet. And when you take psilocybin or you have a really stressful experience and you're traumatized and you hallucinate the same things, right? Like this is kind of the psychological archetype
yeah,
explanation. Okay, so there's a hypothesis that
yeah,
materialists can be comfortable with, right? Like,
yeah,
why did the Nazca do this to their people? Because somebody important in their community hallucinated this, and it was really important to them, and then they built a whole cultural practice around it. There, and you could still stay a materialist, right?
yeah,
So like it's just crazy to me that this like dichotomy of it's either a hoax or it's a dried out alien body exists. And so I mean it gets really complicated and delicate though, because like I have people who I consider to be friends now,
mhm,
who disagree with me about the Nazca mummies, who continue to think that I'm just who continue to very verbally yell at me or like very literally yell at me that I'm just like everybody else. I'm not listening to the Latin American scientists. I'm just another white American ignoring everybody. Now, I will say that the people who are the loudest and most obnoxious about that are the journalists. They're not the
yeah,
scientists, right?
yeah,
The scientists who I have spoken to are not like that.
yeah,
They might or may not agree with me. But we have this common shared perspective on we want to do the same kinds of tests. We want to gather the data. The data will lead us to the truth, right? But those people, the kind of quiet behind the scenes people who are actually getting the science done, they're not the ones blathering on the internet and like literally yelling at me for an hour on a podcast expose because stole a screen cap out of my podcast interview where they pulled up my WhatsApp screen and they saw that back in November I spoke to somebody in the Ministry of Culture in Peru. That literally happened. And like, yes, I spoke to the Ministry of Culture in Peru. Did you not actually watch my first video where I said that I spoke to the Ministry of Culture in Peru? Of course, as an intellectually responsible academic, of
Yes.
course I would talk to the Ministry of Culture in Peru when I
Yeah.
was trying to understand what these things are, right? Like, anyways.
So, I mean, how much of a question is there still to any of this? I mean, like you looked at all the materials, and do you feel like for yourself that it's a settled question at this point, or are there still things that need to be determined that would push it further one way or the other, or could push it back for you? I mean, what do you think are sort of the
Yeah,
unresolved parts of it?
there are definitely still unresolved parts of it. I tried to make this clear in the kind of second video that I did on this topic, was kind of where I think the unresolved questions still are.
And I will link that in the description so people can
Thank
get a
you, thank
longer
you.
version of all this. Yeah.
Um, in my view, and I just like, let me just, for the sake of the people who I love in this space who still disagree with me, I am open to correction. We are seeking the data together. Let us get the data. The data will lead us to the truth, right? But if you're
Yeah.
asking me, as you are asking me, what is my assessment of the situation with my team of people who I have worked with, who do not want to be public, all of them, for obvious reasons.
Yes.
And it's not because they're not qualified. They are top tier people at best institutions on the planet for many of the things that they work on, working with like award-winning, serious hardcore. These are serious people that I spoke to. These are not hacks, right?
Yeah.
And
And it's
that's
only
why they
obvious
don't
why
want to
they
go
would.
public.
Exactly right, especially with the way that you've been treated out of all
Yeah,
this by doing
right.
something just because you're trying to find an answer, you get crucified for it, and it's like obvious that why people wouldn't want to dangle their, anyway.
So here we go. Okay, but I will state, in my view, it is not controversial at all that the J-type skulls are llama skull components. There are lots of reasons why. This is not based off of one case. This is based off of all of the CT scans of all of the bodies, and the shape of their skulls and how they could. I can go through step by step and show you for every single one of the J-type skulls how it shows telltale marks of being a modified llama skull. This is not a
Mhm.
singular case. This is all of the cases.
Yeah.
Um, and like, okay, so the skulls are that. The bodies, the torsos are largely coherent. This is part of what puzzled me for so long, in particular the spinal column and how it incorporates with the ribs. It is coherent. So the spinal column and ribs in a J type were like that from the source organism, whatever that was. Best guess we have right now is human infant, because of the shape of the pelvis in particular. The human pelvis at that age is not fused, so the kind of big plates at the top are floating. Um, Here's my little plastic skeleton, right? So this is an adult pelvis, but in an infant, the kind of winged parts, I don't know the names because I'm not an anatomist.
Yeah.
These are not fused, so it's just those, and they're kind of floating around, and so that's why they're oriented differently in different ones of the J types. So you take a human, you cut off parts of this, you cut all these ribs, and then you pinch them and fuse them to make the torso narrower. And then you put a llama skull on the top. And there's various other things you have to do that are relatively modest, but that's what a J type is. M types are anatomically human in every way except for the elongated head, the external features, and the strange hands and feet. The bones that are in the strange hands and feet are consistent with the kind of mutilation, physical alteration hypothesis, except for there are puzzles about how there don't seem to be marks, right? This is why, and just consistently, people keep saying like hand surgeons are looking at these things and saying this is not these are not fake, right? And the problem here is the concept fake isn't being articulated
Yeah.
clearly,
Yeah.
right? I take it to be that what they are correctly perceiving is that these were not modified recently. And in my view, they were probably not modified post-mortem. Because if you took a dead body and you cut off the thumbs and pinkies, then there would be an obvious it couldn't heal, so there would be a
Exactly.
gap,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
they're looking and there's not a gap. So, but this is consistent with it being done in childhood and then healing, I believe.
Yeah.
Now, there are still some puzzles here, right? There's claims made about fingertips in particular. The fingerprint marks are different on at least some of them. At least Maria, the one that came first in the discovery process, and the one that I have named them all after M types are just like Maria, because Maria is different from almost all the other M types. I haven't followed up on all of the M types. There's been more that have come out since I kind of stopped paying attention mostly. Um, but Maria does not have the right number of bones in her hands for the hypothesis I gave, right? So one, two, three, four bones in the hand, but she has an extra one on the end of her finger. And if you look at the scans, it looks like the last phalange of her fingers have been cut off, and then two phalanges, or either somebody else's, the last two uh, uh, knuckles of somebody else's fingers, or perhaps somebody else's toes were attached at that part and then healed. You can see in the scan that the bone, if you take a normal human finger, this bone is smaller than this one. But if you look at Maria's fingers, this bone, like the end of this bone that attaches to this, is too big.
Yeah.
So if she was modified physically, then she has somebody else's fingers or toes transplanted onto the ends of her mutilated hands.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's what she is, personally.
Yeah. Yeah.
But other hypotheses are still being considered about possible natural genetic variation, of course. This
That's what I
could.
was, one thing I was wondering. Could it just be,
Mhm.
a mutation that somehow,
Yep. So it could be a mutation. Of course, it could be something very exotic like genetic engineering. Those are hypotheses that are worth considering if we believe that there are these kind of abductee accounts are real, and which I do believe that at least some of these abductee accounts are real, or that
yeah.
real gets messy too, though, right?
Yeah.
But
It's like,
fair
who
enough.
knows what space it's in, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
yeah, exactly. Um, but uh, but okay, like genetic modification is a possibility, of course. Hybridization is a possibility, especially if it's possible that we're dealing with beings with very superior technology. Then yeah, we should at least consider this possibility. Now, it would have some markers left in the genes, right? And although we're dealing with ancient DNA, and ancient DNA is extremely difficult to get right because DNA strands are very, very long and they break over time, and you have to reconstruct them using all these mathematical models, right? Like imagine having 100 copies of, I don't know, Harry Potter, and you throw it all into a paper shredder, right? Like you could take it out and like find, oh, there's like half a word here and or like whatever, like 3 or 4 words and 3 or 4 words, so I can line that up, and you could reconstruct Harry Potter from like a bunch of shredded copies of Harry Potter. That's basically how DNA reconstruction works in order to be able to do the analysis that you want to do to compare it against other groups of humans and other non-humans. And so the data is very difficult to parse, and you have to have quite a lot of skill to do this. And unfortunately, the people who have been the most vocal about the DNA of the Nazca mummies have not done a responsible job in constructing that data and analyzing it carefully before they go public. This has certainly been a problem. And again, I don't blame this so much on the scientists as I do on the journalists. There's been this like
Push.
sensationalist pressure to
Yeah.
announce like the second something happens. This happened to our team. Like we were talking to one of the Latin American scientists. My DNA person, Elena, was talking to one of the Latin American scientists about an idea that had come up in the data that we thought might be an indication of some kind of a genetic engineering marker. And then like that day or the day after, that was on like a podcast. And it's like, guys, like this is not how science works.
Yeah.
We have to have some time to sit with hypotheses and test them. And that hypothesis, from what I understand, didn't pan out, but it's still part of the lore that people yell at me, right? Like,
Yeah.
but Steve, they found genetic markers. And it's like, no, they didn't. That was my friend Elena. We talked about that. I was in the room where we were talking about that as a possible discovery when it leaked. Like,
Yeah.
no, that's not true. But
Yeah.
at this point, it's taken on a life of its own, and it's very, very messy and complicated. But at the end of the day, is there work to do? Yes. Careful genetic work remains to be done,
Yeah.
including ideally a more careful collection of DNA samples in a controlled environment. So like ideally what you would do with a mummy like that is you would have it in a like a clean room and you would drill into a tooth and get DNA from inside of that. All of this has to be done under like super sanitized conditions and keep it cold and then like this is just like I've seen the videos of the sampling being done and it was not done under ideal conditions, right? And so the data is not the best kind of data we could get. Could we get better DNA data? Yes. Does the data that we have right now indicate alien or hybrid or non-human? The answer is no. It does not indicate that. It's not clear what it indicates. Does it leave that open? Maybe, although from what I understand, the people who've done the most careful DNA analysis are basically saying, nope, they're just human. Um, Although there are some interesting things in there that might indicate some kind of a mutation or some kind of a change, but it's not an alien. It's a human. It's a human with potentially some oddities in the DNA that might be explanatory. It's a huge and very difficult question. Like, if this
Yeah.
is right,
Yeah.
right? Like if Maria is a genetically modified hybrid human or something, right? Like somebody tweaked her so that she would have tridactyl hands and feet. Like to just to be able to pull that out of the DNA data conclusively 1500 years later, like that's a very difficult technical task, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, work to do, better samples, more carefully analyzed, closer analysis of the surface features of the hands and feet in particular, careful analysis of the skulls themselves. There can be, and from what I understand in talking to people at the University of Ica, there usually are physical marks in the skull that remain to show that they were skull-bound, and apparently those marks are not present on M-type skulls. I was at least told this by someone who's I think it was an anthropologist at University of Ica, and okay, like, look, great, that's an open question. Then, can we
Yeah.
explain this with skull binding, or is this something? Do we need a genetic explanation or a physical explanation? And yeah, so there's actually hard, careful science that definitely still needs to be done. And do I personally think it will disrupt the conclusion that I find most plausible right now? No. But okay, what does that matter? Like let's
Yeah.
go do the science.
Yeah. I love that attitude. I mean, after having reviewed all that you've been through with this, I mean, do you regret having engaged with it? And then
No.
also, what would your advice be to academics like yourself who are looking to get involved in this? How can they protect themselves, and how can they do the best kind of work, despite the fact that it turns into a circus a little bit with all the peripherals? I mean, and I think that that's a general statement you can make about a lot of this. When people are invested in the outcome of what the science is, especially ontologically, it turns into this kind of,
Yeah.
carnival.
I mean, this is okay. So the first answer to the first question is no. I definitely don't regret being involved in this. I continue to believe that the Nazca mummies are important things
Yeah,
um, that need to be understood, and I continue to believe that understanding them will help us understand NHI phenomenon, which I believe are real, right? I believe that we are not alone in the universe. There are other intelligences engaging with us somehow in the physical space, in the dream world, I don't understand how this works, right?
yeah,
But I believe there are non-human intelligences engaging us, and I believe the Nazca mummies are a clue. This is why I care about getting it right, because
yeah,
if it didn't matter, then we could be sloppy about the conclusions, but it actually really matters. So we want the most precise, most accurate answers we can get, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the answer to your first question. The answer to your second question is on look, unfortunately, the answer to this question is if you can't handle the circus, then don't speak publicly about this
Yeah.
because it is still true that you will be, it's a circus out there.
Yeah.
And, I believe that the tides are changing, right? So I am now director of this organization called The Visible College, thevisiblecollege.org.
Okay.
And
Yeah. I'll link that for sure.
we are collecting a serious scholarly, academic, and other kinds of professional people who are paying attention to UAP, NHI, anomalous, paranormal kinds of things, and trying to do that with scholarly rigor. Um, and as an organization, we put forth no conclusions, right? Other than we believe that this is a serious subject. We believe that these are subjects of serious scholarly inquiry. That's it, right? So we have space for people all over the spectrum of like hyper skeptics all the way up to hyper believers, and it doesn't matter. All we're saying is this is worth doing. And I think as long as you can come at it with that kind of an attitude, like the more of us that feel comfortable doing this, the more the tide turns, right? Like simply being visible. This is why we called it the Visible College. This is a joke for UFO insiders that there's a group of people called the Invisible College, Jacques Vallée and others like and J. Allen Hynek and friends who kind of looked at this stuff a long time ago, but mostly had to be secretive about it because they were ridiculed so much. And
Mhm.
and so we are not claiming to be we consider ourselves deeply indebted to Jacques and the others who did that work. So we're not kind of, anyways. The point is, we believe that the time has come for more and more people who have the kind of academic credentials to kind of be able to turn the tide a little bit, to come out and say, just this is worth looking at.
Yeah.
It's not stupid. There's something interesting here. It's worth being interested in a scholarly, careful way about. That's all we're doing. And so, even then, even with that kind of minimal threshold, it's difficult to get people to do it, right? And we do not pressure anyone to do it. In fact, so there are invisible members of the Visible College, right? There are people who we want it to be. If you're interested, come talk to us. Like let's kind of discuss what there is and how you're doing and what you think you might want to do. And it's a separate question whether you want to be up on the website as being a person who's out. And we don't encourage it. We don't encourage it, right?
Yeah.
Like we want it. We think
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
important, but it will be difficult for you. You are putting yourself at a certain amount of risk. And yeah, so yeah, unfortunately, I had yeah, I have had I've talked to most of the kind of important, influential people in this world now.
Hmm.
Most of the names that go on the podcast, and like I've spoken to them in one capacity or another, and I think we all would give the same advice, like be careful in what you say when, and if you can't handle the circus, then don't play with the monkeys because yeah, it's crazy out there.
There's a lot of monkeys.
There's a lot of monkeys, and some of them are very angry monkeys, and some of them have a lot of some of them have a lot invested socially, financially, in specific ways of understanding what's going on, and those people will attack you if you cross their preferred way of understanding what's happening.
Well, that's pretty much all I had for you. That was a fantastic conversation. Thank
I
you. I'd
appreciate
like
it.
I try to keep my interviews relatively
Yeah,
short, but I'd
yeah,
like to have you back at some point if you'd be
yeah.
willing.
Let's do it.
Uh,
This is one of the better interviews. I appreciate you doing your work and asking great questions.
well, thank you. And I'm really interested in that sort of ontological piece. That's where I've spent a lot of my time. And so maybe we could explore that more and your personal
Yeah,
journey there or
yeah.
whatever. But
Let's do it.
thank you so much, man. I really appreciate you and I admire what you're doing. And good luck. Watch out for the monkeys
Yeah,
because
thank you.